Broadcasting the information the mainstream media won't touch. This is The Richie Allen Show in association with DavidIke.com.
Let's introduce our first guest, and it's her debut on this particular programme, but she'll be known to many of our listeners, and she'll particularly be known to the audience, to the followers of AlternateCurrentRadio.com. She's an investigative journalist, photographer, and a member of the Syrian Solidarity Movement Steering Committee. And as I mentioned at the top of the programme, you can read her regularly on 21stCenturyWire.com. Delighted to welcome from France, live from France, the lovely Vanessa Beeley. Vanessa, welcome. How are you?
Thank you very much, Richie. That was certainly an introduction. Thank you.
I'm telling you, that's all I do. That's all I do is introductions. I do introductions and I shut up. You know, it is good to have you on. I listen to you regularly. I've heard you on Sunday Wire with Patrick and the gang a lot. And I said, I must get this lady on because she knows what she's talking about. And you're very well briefed, Vanessa. I love people who are well briefed and who know what they're talking about. Now, we're going to talk about the Syrian town of Madaya, or Madaya. I think it's pronounced Madaya. And the massive media coverage of the situation allegedly faced by the people of that town because medical supplies and food and clean water can't get in there. That's what we're being told about that. And I want to get to that in a minute. We'll talk about that in general. But I can't not ask you straight off the bat about the news today coming out of Turkey that a suicide bomber allegedly connected to ISIS detonated a bomb just outside Istanbul, I believe, in an ancient town, and killed over 10 people, 9 of whom were Germans. Now, in the monologue of this programme, I was asking the question, why would the leaders of Islamic State want to cause any trouble inside Turkey when the Turks are in bed with them in terms of buying even their oil and supplying them with arms and money? And I asked the question, and I'm going to ask you that question and get out of your way then. I wonder, are the nationalities of the victims, 9 of them being German, has that got anything to do with this rather bizarre bomb outside Istanbul today? What are your initial thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. It's not something I've sort of given a huge amount of attention to today, but my first reaction would be on hearing that they were German citizens that were killed, would be that, you know, we are seeing a sort of a jockeying for position in Europe at the moment, and that's being affected by the refugee crisis. The German-Russian relations are definitely a threat to the US, who's been sort of promoting Germany as their top dog in Europe for a fair amount of time now, and they're not going to like to see the German-Russian relations improving, as that threatens the sort of the unipolar world that the states would like to maintain. We're seeing also that Germany, as we know, is still occupied. I think there's over 50,000 US, UK and French soldiers in Germany. The US itself has placed, I think, nuclear weapons in Buchel Air Base. So while Germany is attempting to improve its relations with the East, it's being occupied by the West. So for me, it's just interesting. We're seeing obvious signs of empowerment and emancipation of Russia globally now. And we know that Germany, with Russian commodities, German technology and Chinese wealth, would see a lot of growth. And again, this is threatening the US hegemony. So that's the first thing that sort of springs to my mind. It's not only the punishment that Germany is receiving via, to some extent, the manipulated refugee crisis, but are we also seeing a little bit of a shot across their bows now in Turkey?
Yeah, good stuff. It's what I was thinking today, hearing that. Loads of tweets on this already. Alex Doust was on to say on Twitter, I'm suspicious whenever, less than 24 hours after the event, the government claims to know everything that has happened. We did mention that a bit earlier on. And there's a question for you on the town of Madaya, which we're here to talk about. And this is from Doc, who sent this. Early question, Richie, for Vanessa. Has she any comment on the reused images that mainstream media is using to shock the public? Why are they doing this so blatantly? And there was a post on DavidIke.com about this today. Reusing and rehashing these images on our screens about Madaya. Why is that going on, asks Doc.
Well, I think, funnily enough, just before I came on, I put together the questions that I said in my own mind that the mainstream media should have been asking regarding Madaya before they sort of reflex, knee-jerk reacted to this situation. As John Pilger said, I think the information age is actually a media age. We now have war by media, censorship by media, and demonology by media. And certainly we're seeing the demonology by media as regards Syria. I was also just listening to an interview with Dr. Al-Jafri, the Syrian permanent representative to the UN. And obviously he was asked by the Al Jazeera journalist various questions about Madaya, and he blatantly turned around to Al Jazeera and he said, "You are the one responsible for propagating fake photographs." And I'll continue talking about what else he talked about in this interview because it's very interesting and it's obviously relevant to Madaya and to the entire situation in Syria. But as I said, yes, the speed with which our mainstream media, and that includes the BBC, by the way, that put out a report regurgitating a bit of footage from Yarmouk 2014 and used it to represent Madaya in 2016. Now, that went viral. It was picked up very quickly. It was actually picked up by myself and Patrick, and it was published on 21st Century Wire almost immediately. That video has been taken down, but we've kept copies of it. But it's just indicative of the levels to which our mainstream media will do nothing to derail interventionism, war, destruction, devastation of sovereign nations.
Yeah, they're complicit, aren't they? It's complicity in the most obvious sense. You see it, there is absolutely no questioning whatsoever of the official line on anything. And nobody on the BBC or on Sky or on CNN is asking the question, well, maybe if 3-4 years ago, if our intelligence agencies weren't covertly supplying money, weapons and weapons of mass destruction and everything else to so-called moderate rebels to take down the Syrian government, we wouldn't have situations like this now. This is a taboo subject. You're not supposed to get into that.
No, I mean, I think it's even more complex than that. Again, I was reflecting on it just before coming on, and I think what we see and what we are seeing in Syria is almost a triangle of industrial complexes. We're seeing what I would call the extremist terrorist, in brackets, industrial complex. We're seeing the humanitarian NGO industrial complex, which is being exposed far more in Syria than it ever has previously, but it's pretty insidious. And I would put it up there with one of the most malevolent weapons of mass destruction that the US, NATO, the Gulf states, and Israel has as its command. And then obviously we have the military-industrial complex, but the military-industrial complex can't actually survive without, if you like, the religious-industrial complex and the humanitarian-industrial complex. Those two complexes are needed to almost build the bridge to enable the intervention, military, economic, political, it doesn't matter what it is, in any target nation.
The public at large, people not listening to programmes like this, people who get their news from the BBC or Channel 4, or who don't get their news at all, go about their daily business. Do you think even hearing us talk about this, do you think that people care, Vanessa? Do you think anybody cares anymore? Do you think, because I have this horrible sinking feeling that people have been saturated with this for so long, for the last 15, 20 years. And it's been going on a lot longer than that. But it's been ramped up since since September the 11th and the invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan. Do you think that people are just fed up of it? And it doesn't matter what we say, you say, or anybody else says. It's a case of, they do what they do. And people just, look the other way. Depressing thought, of course.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's a very good question. And it's certainly something that we puzzle over eternally. When Al Jazeera produced, I think it was about a 30-second video with fake images and emotive music and heart-wringing images, which are fake, that received over 10 million hits. Okay, yes, we know, as Patrick points out to me all the time, those can be manipulated. But nevertheless, it was very widely shared. And we saw it with Aylan Kurdi, the refugee boy that was washed up on the shores of Turkey or Greece. I actually can't remember right now.
I think it was Turkey,
yeah. We saw again an immediate reaction from the public. So I don't think it's a lack of compassion or a lack of care about what is happening, but it's a channeled compassion, and we're dealing with such a powerful, manipulating, engineering, directing, nudging complex that pushes people's emotional buttons in very clever, in very insidious, in very subliminal ways. And it's this entire industry that we are constantly fighting to try and, if you like, derail that reflex action to the propaganda and to undermine the propaganda. One thing I will say about Madaya is I think they miscalculated the use or the damage that this particular campaign would do. It almost came out of nowhere. It almost came the same day as the execution of Sheikh al-Nimr in Saudi Arabia, which elicited a stream of protest and horror at the brutal executions that went on, lawless executions that went on in Saudi Arabia, and also the sort of complicity with our own government, particularly in the UK, with Saudi brutality and oppression of its own people and, of course, of surrounding regional countries like Yemen. And going on, the terror armies that we're seeing in Syria, Libya, Iraq, and so on.
And I know you wanted to talk about the effects on Yemen of what's happening in Syria. I mean, we'll come to that. But it's amazing you mentioning Nimr al-Nimr, because I, like you, watch all the flagship news review programmes on the BBC and Sky and Channel 4. To their credit now, and we spend a lot of time taking them apart on this programme because of what they don't say, but to their credit, when we learned about the horrific executions 10 days ago in Saudi Arabia, and you couldn't fail but be, absolutely repulsed at the idea of dissidents, of political opponents, not criminals, being treated like that, being murdered like that. But to be fair to these mainstream media organisations, most of them did aggressively challenge Conservative Party MPs and ministers on various programmes, asking them, how could we possibly be doing business with this particular regime? And they got the stock answer, strategic reasons. You can't. In fact, Krishna Gurumurthy on Channel 4 was told by a Tory, how can you prove that Nimr al-Nimr wasn't violent and that he wasn't a terrorist? And it blatantly, but to be fair, at least they did put those questions to them. But I suppose the problem is they won't continually ask them. They'll ask them once, and then those questions will be shelved, and Britain will continue to peddle arms through Saudi Arabia, which will be used to kill people in Yemen, in Gaza, and anywhere bloody else that people are killed. But they are asking the questions. But when it comes to Saudi Arabia, it's with successive governments in this country, all bets are off. We don't talk about Saudi Arabia.
No, of course we don't, because we're in fact the largest exporter to Saudi Arabia, not only of arms, but there are, I think, as you're probably perfectly aware, there's very aggressive trade deals going on, being very aggressively chased by our current government. And so we supply, I think, the UK supplies 36% of KSA Saudi Arabian imports. So not only weapons, but we're looking at, and we know that, they have infiltrated many of our institutions, many of our traditional media, commerce, services in the UK. So there is a very aggressive push to create trade links with Saudi Arabia. So they're not going to jeopardize this. I think what you saw was, if you like, a sort of smoke and mirrors job of looking as if they are being aggressive. In Saudi Arabia, but then almost immediately we get the sort of get out of jail free clause, which is the Madaya situation, which almost immediately blows up and totally distracts the stream of protest away from Saudi Arabia, not only away from Saudi Arabia, but then becomes an anti-Shia propaganda campaign. If we notice, it's Hezbollah, a Shia organization, that is perpetrating the siege against the residents of Madaya, right? And we then start to also see, hyperbole slipping in there that Sheikh Nimr was a member of the Shirazi clan, which is absolute rubbish. Shirazi is actually, it's a sect that was, again, created by Saudi Arabia to if you like, create another brand name within Saudi Arabia itself that they could turn to and say, oh, look how vicious and what savages these Shia Muslims are. It's actually a recognized terrorist brand in Iran, by the way.
Do you know, Vanessa, what you're saying there, and I can't help but agree with you. Proof is a word which has disappeared from the English dictionary. You know, mainstream news presenters, and I mean, we live in an era. I grew up in the media, and I was trained as a programme producer and presenter in commercial radio in Ireland, properly trained by a proper organisation. And even then, in the mid to late 90s, I have to admit I was a bit naive. I never believed that we would see the American style of news presentation arrive on our shores, where basically presenters weren't giving you a handful of facts that they had gathered about a war zone or whatever and giving you both sides of it. We now, of course, we have nothing but 24-hour commentary, and proof goes out the window. As you said, they can claim all these things about these Shia groups, offer no proof whatsoever. By the way, folks, follow Vanessa Beeley at thewallwillfall.wordpress.com. Now, I've just tweeted that out there. That's where her blog is, thewallwillfall.wordpress.com. Terrific journalism there. I was talking earlier on in the programme about the protests in Leipzig in Germany last night, and I was talking about the sickening sight of people protesting with Pegida, people protesting with Britain's First, and some of these other groups. And I kind of came to believe that we're in a kind of a paradoxical situation, Vanessa. While there are many of us within the independent media who understand that one of the intended consequences of destroying large swathes of land and indeed destroying countries in the Middle East, as we've seen in Libya and Afghanistan and Iraq and Syria, is to drive people out of the countries because they've terrorised them, they've nowhere to go, their homes are destroyed, their family is dead. An intended consequence is, of course, to drive people into Europe, to ultimately bring about the death of the nation state, remove any sort of nationalism in terms of the ideology or the beliefs behind nationalism, good or bad. I believe that. But at the same time, when our governments have been complicit in destroying the lives of innocent men, women and children, it is incumbent on us to do our best to help those people who are leaving those countries. It's an amazing paradox. It really is. And I don't have the answer to it. What are your thoughts on it?
Well, I mean, I think if we go back to Sheikh Nimr, we have to understand that as an opposition leader, and he didn't put himself forward as a religious cleric. He put himself forward very much as a teacher, an activist, and an opposition leader, but mostly a guide and a teacher, very much as his father was before him. But we also have to understand that under his leadership, imperial powers would contend with a united and free Arabia. And this is what, when we start to connect the dots, we see that worldwide, globally, these attempts at creating what is a verifiable, true democracy or even a republic, some form of unity, freedom from oppression, from imperialism, from fascism, from neocolonialism, that is being derailed and undermined wherever it is flourishing. If we take Sheikh al-Nimr as the starting point, we then go to Bahrain and we look at Sheikh Ali Salman, again a Shia, a reformist, fighting for human rights against the Saudi human rights violations in Bahrain, against authoritarianism. We're seeing, again, in Nigeria, back in December, I was with Sheikh Ibrahim Zakzaki and his son Hamad Zakzaki in Beirut at a conference on Palestine. They left on the 11th of December. On the 12th of December, he was arrested. He was beaten, shot, arrested. His wife was shot and his son was killed, massacred, along with up to 1,000 of his followers. Again, a man that represents unity of all religions and faiths and creeds and nationalities across Africa, not only in Nigeria, but also someone who was exposing the US hegemony in the region, exposing the branding and the trade naming of the terrorist factions, i.e. Boko Haram, in Nigeria, which we know to be another US creation there to destabilize Nigeria. And again, to prevent the growth of its partnership with China, because China is, if you like, developing Nigeria in a completely different way to the US. It's developing it by building factories, by putting in infrastructure, by partnering Nigeria, which is an anathema to the US hegemony, which is just to plunder and rape and pillage a country and to leave the people far poorer and hungrier than they were when they arrived. And again, if we then swing back and we go into Syria, whatever we think of Assad, whatever our personal opinion of him is as a leader or as a man, we cannot deny the fact that it is his dignity, his ability to deal with hostile propaganda, hostile media, hostile hordes of terrorists that are being imposed upon his country by our governments in coalition with the Gulf states and Israel. His ability to unite his people and to evoke their loyalty to him, including the Syrian Arab Army, which is made up of the Syrian people. But it is all of these qualities in him and in his government and in the reconciliation processes that are ongoing within Syria itself that will take Syria from this hell that we have created for them into peace and healing. Of that, I am convinced.
Yeah, I'm just worried. Listen, it's wonderful to hear a positive message and a positive take on it. I worry, of course, that, David Cameron was given evidence to a parliamentary committee in Westminster today, and he was asked questions about the 70,000 moderate army that's supposedly ready to take up the baton. Of course, he had no answers for that, and he wasn't pressed too hard by the committee either, unsurprisingly. But I worry that, it won't be long before they start talking about the need to send in the army. We've had former heads of the army on national radio in the last few days saying that this bombing campaign is just pussyfooting around. It can't do any good. To take on ISIS, we have to get in there, and I really worry about that. We've got Vanessa Beeley on the line, folks. It's 15 minutes to the top of the hour. I mentioned her blog already. I'm going to mention it again. It's thewallwillfall.wordpress.com. Clinical analysis, by the way, of what's going on in Syria, in Yemen, in North Africa, and the region as a whole, Gaza. Vanessa's visited all these places, by the way. If you find her on social media and look at some of her, if you're voyeuristic like me and you start looking at all her photographs, you'll see that she's been around and she's met people in all of these regions around the world. It's ironic, Vanessa, being a political news presenter, as I have been for a long time. I remember when Bashar al-Assad ascended to the highest office in Syria. I remember, of course, he wasn't supposed to. His brother was supposed to, and of course, his brother died. And Bashar was a doctor. He's an ophthalmologist, I believe. And he was saying, that he wanted to bring about reform and that it would take 10, 12, 15 years, but he wanted to open up the country. And he was lauded by the West as a great reformer, somebody you could trust, somebody you could do business with. And of course, when people like Assad start to do things in the interest of their own people, in the national interest, well, then they must become the devil incarnate very quickly. We must go after. And that sounds very simplistic, but it's pretty much a fact. Sarah was on Twitter to say, Richie, this lady is a smart cookie. Great find. Thanks, Sarah, for that. Doc was on to say, does Vanessa think the destruction of Syria, Iraq is a plan for expanding the lands of Israel, Saudi Arabia and Turkey? This is an interesting question, and it did come up last time Patrick Henningsen was on this programme. Are we talking about the greater Israel here?
Well, I mean, that's an interesting question, because if we, I certainly believe that the Yinon plan, which I'm guessing everybody is aware of, which is basically the Balkanization of the Middle East, and dividing up into partitions. If we look at, I'll take two examples. One is the Madaya situation. One thing that has been completely overlooked, as I say, just as an exercise today, I wrote down all the questions that none of the mainstream media have asked, and I was hitting about 36 questions by the end. So I'm not going to tell you what all of them are. You'll be glad to know. But one of the important ones is, and what nobody has actually broached, is the importance of this area, not only to the terrorists, to Ara al-Sham, al-Nusra, and the sort of minimal percentage of FSA that are involved. By the way, the FSA, which are sort of loosely described as the, in inverted commas, moderate rebels, cannot function logistically or militarily without without al-Nusra or Ara al-Sham or ISIS or Daesh help, both from the point of view of weapons. Equally, al-Nusra, Ara al-Sham, and Daesh do need the FSA because the FSA are actually receiving a lot of the military hardware from the States, the UK, NATO, etc. That's just a quick aside. But if we look at the area of Zabadani and where it is, and Madaya makes up part of this area, it was actually a tourist area, but it's also a fairly mountainous area right on the Lebanese border. It was historically the area where the Palestinian refugee camps settled before they dispersed into the rest of Syria. It's also then evolved into, if you like, the headquarters of the Hezbollah brigades, and is the hub of receiving equipment from Lebanon into Syria. So we immediately have to ask, well, okay, then obviously it's going to be strategically pivotal to Israel to destroy. We've seen them come into Damascus and target Samia Kunta, who's a Hezbollah leader. So we know that is part of their agenda. So we have to start asking ourselves why these rebels that are occupying Madaya, of which there are 600, the majority of which are Ara al-Sham, why in fact they were not taking the benefit of the amnesty agreement. We can then start to extrapolate out and realize that probably Israel, who is controlling and hospitalizing these wounded rebels when they are injured on the battlefield and then sending them back into Syria to continue fighting, that is proven. The leadership was basically saying, no, you have to stay there because Zabadani is crucial, it's pivotal. Why is it pivotal? Because Israel wants to cleanse Syria of the resistance, and it wants to break and dismantle the axis of resistance to Israel's hegemony in the region, along with the states and NATO. So, yeah, that's a very important question, and it's very relative to Madaya itself.
It certainly is. And on Madaya, by the way, Sean was on to ask, Richie, please ask Vanessa what she thinks about the food supplies and the UN boots on the ground being a cover for even more funneling of weapons and money to the so-called Islamic State. Now that, of course, at one time in my career, back in the days when I was working in the MSM, I would have laughed out loud at any such suggestion. But it's a good question by Sean, because with all eyes on Syria at the moment, even though the Turks are obviously buying oil that ISIS has stolen from parts of Syria, it seems that because there's so much attention on the country, it's difficult maybe, or it's more difficult now to get the tactical equipment and money to ISIS. So Sean is saying, well, what about this particular Madaya situation being used to do that very thing? What do you think?
Well, again, it's a very interesting question. If we go back, I think it is 2014, to the murder of Farina Shim on the border with Turkey when she was covering Kobani. And she reported that the World Food Programme, which we know is 50% owned by Bill Gates, was funneling equipment, terrorists and arms into Syria to Daesh and ISIS via their humanitarian runs. And we know that the Turkish border, for example, has been a rat run since the beginning of the war on Syria for various humanitarian agencies to funnel weapons into and terrorists out of Syria, and probably oil and whatever other sort of resources they're getting out and selling via Turkey to Israel. But as regards the UN deliveries into Madaya, it's again an interesting question. And one thing that I picked up on, as soon as the Madaya situation blew up, the propaganda storm whipped up, There were a number of very spurious NGOs putting out very major donation programs asking for money. There was one in particular that is connected back, as most of them are, to the sort of the US government, to Congress, and to our friend George Soros. But this one in particular that made it quite clear that the starvation was down to the inflated prices, the extortionate prices of the foodstuffs that were available, but were being charged extortionate prices for, I think, $150 for a kilo of rice.
Wow.
This particular NGO, or however you want to describe it, had raised over $122,000 of a target of $180,000 in less than a couple of days. Now, I would be immediately suspicious that we're seeing a propaganda storm like this coming up at a time, as we've discussed, when world protest was turning against Saudi Arabia. 1. 2, we're coming into the Geneva conference at the end of January. And as Dr. Al-Jafri said tonight, it's classic procedure. They're going to torpedo the peace talks. Just as Syria arrives at some semblance of a political resolution, it will be torpedoed. And this is what we're seeing again. 2, again, we're seeing the UK also talking about RAF food drops. And as Patrick said last night, well, that's code for arms drops into the region. So if we take the fact that it is a very pivotally strategic area for Israel, if we take the fact that we believe Israel is putting pressure on Ara al-Sham not to accept amnesty and for the rebels not to leave Madaya and to keep the civilians there and use them, 1, as human shields, 2, as propaganda, in order to maintain the pressure on the Hezbollah brigades in the region. There is, I would certainly say, the Red Cross delivery in October would have been food. I would not suspect Red Cross particularly. Would the UN take arms in? I'm not entirely sure. I would say that the Syrian government is way too canny for that. But what it may be trying to do is to open up avenues, as you say, for airdrops of some description, for finances to be taken into them. That's another way of doing it, yes. So I certainly believe it's a way of strengthening and reinforcing the fight against Hezbollah in the region. Definitely.
Vanessa, we're just about out of time on that.
Right.
We covered a lot. Thanks for doing it. Vanessa can be found at thewallwillfall.wordpress.com. This is the very essence of the reason why this particular programme was set up in September of 2014. It's to present this sort of analysis, which is disgracefully absent from the mainstream media. This is intellectual, outstandingly briefed analysis of what's going on in that region. And apart from RT from time to time, and maybe Press TV from time to time, outside of the independent media, you don't hear it. Vanessa, don't be a stranger. Come back on the programme again soon. Lovely to have you on, and thanks for that analysis, and keep up the great work.
You're welcome. Take care, Richie.
Bye for now. Vanessa Beeley on the line to us there from her home in France. Thewallwillfall.wordpress.com is where you can find Vanessa. Do check her out there. She's absolutely terrific.